Good morning. As Don indicated, I've been asked to talk on the topic of the competitiveness of the Australian livestock export industry. And clearly, there can be no doubt that this Australian livestock export industry is an extremely competitive industry. Evidence exists in abundance of the competitiveness of the Australian livestock industry. Evidence exists in the form of the longevity of the industry, the fact that this is an industry that's been around since 1829, that's been around for nigh on 200 years. Evidence exists of the competitiveness of the industry in terms of the recent growth that the industry has experienced, growth in export sales that have gone from $0.5 billion in 1995 to $1.5 billion last year, a threefold growth over the space of 20 years. Evidence exists of the competitiveness of the industry in the commanding position that it occupies across the world. Last year, Australia was the world's foremost cattle exporter, exporting 1.3 million head of cattle, slightly more than Canada, slightly more than Mexico, and considerably more than places like Brazil and the EU. I mean, the Australian industry occupies about 15% of the world's cattle exports. And it's a similar story with sheep. Australia is also one of the world's top sheep exporters, shipping 2.3 million head of sheep last year, just behind Somalia and just in front of the European Union. And I mean, isn't it interesting, really, how many sheep are now going out of the European Union? Of course, a lot of them are going out of what used to be Eastern Europe in the past, places like Romania. But, you know, I mean, the EU have very fastidious standards of animal welfare internally, but don't have our standards of animal welfare externally. And as for cattle, I mean, our sheep exports contribute at around about 15% of the world's total trade. So evidence of competitiveness in terms of industry longevity and growth, evidence of competitiveness in terms of the position that it occupies on the world stage, and evidence of competitiveness in terms of the fact that it competes successfully for resources in Australia, with live exports typically accounting for 8 to 10% of Australians' total cattle turn-off, slightly above that now, about 12% currently, and about 30 to 40% of Australia's sheep exports, not counting lamb. So clearly here we're dealing with a very competitive, highly successful industry. So, I mean, an obvious question to ask is, what are the essential factors driving this success, driving this competitiveness? Well, first and foremost, the industry, the export industry, is based on a solid foundation. Australian livestock producers produce quality products, quality livestock products at world competitive prices. the right products for the right markets, Bos Indicus blood for Asia, dairy heifers for China, fat-tailed sheep and merinos for the Middle East, the right sort of products at the right sort of prices. I mean, for about a decade now, MLA has belonged to this international benchmarking group called AgriBenchmark that collects data from around the world on typical farms in a number of countries. I mean, the AgriBenchmark data covers around about 90% of the world's cattle production and about 70% of the world's sheep production. The data is collected on a consistent, equivalent, comparable basis from every country. And what this data shows is that the Australian industry produces livestock prices very competitively. Our producers do a fantastic job in a high-cost country of producing livestock products, both cattle and sheep, at very competitive costs. I mean, for cow-calf operations in Australia, from the AgriBenchmark data, and you can see it in this chart here, Australian costs are amongst the very lowest in the world. You know, not about the lowest. I mean, some Australian cow-calf operations are the lowest cost across the world in the AgriBenchmark data set. Lower costs than in Brazil for cow-calf operations, lower costs than in countries like Argentina and Uruguay, and certainly lower costs than European or US cow-calf operations. I mean, for cattle finishing, we're again highly efficient. I mean, we don't do quite as well as we do in cow-calf operations, and of course the cow-calf operations are the operations that support the feeder trade to places like Indonesia. In cattle finishing, we don't do quite as well in terms of lowest cost in the world. I mean, that's occupied by the South Americans, but certainly we have a very efficient cattle finishing industry on pasture and much lower costs than in the UK and in the rest of Europe. And I mean, those lower costs are reflected in the prices for our livestock. I mean, this is a chart that goes back, what, about 15, 16 years, that shows livestock prices in US dollars in Australia and a number of other countries around the world. And you see our livestock prices are generally comparable with livestock prices in South America and significantly lower than feeder cattle prices in the United States. I mean, there are times that our prices receive a premium over South American prices. That certainly occurred in the period of about 2000 to 2008, and it's occurring again now. Of course, one would expect that, given the greater market access that Australia has and the quality and integrity of our livestock production systems. But for many years in this chart, our livestock prices were at comparable levels to those in South America. And it's a similar story for sheep. Again, this comes from the AgriBenchmark data set, and it shows that Australian sheep production costs are amongst the lowest in the world. They're certainly lower than those in Europe and North Africa, and similar to those in South America and Namibia. I mean, New Zealand has lower costs than we do in this area. So, you know, the fact that our livestock production systems in this country are so efficient provides a fabulous foundation for our live export industry. But our live export industry has built on that foundation and has a number of other attributes that help us sell product. And these include the unparalleled market access that we enjoy, proximity to growing markets, the quality of our livestock and the provision of services by our industry and by individual exporters. I mean, we've known for years, I mean, one of the real advantages that Australia enjoys is unparalleled levels of market access. I don't think you'd go to any other country around the world that enjoys the access to world markets that we do for our livestock. I mean, last year we sent livestock and meat prices, livestock and meat products to 150 countries around the world. I mean, obviously the fastidious countries that insist that their livestock comes from countries like Australia and their meat comes from countries like Australia, with the integrity systems that we have, countries like the United States, Japan and Indonesia, fastidious countries. But also goes to a lot of other countries. I mean, countries that you'd hardly ever hear of. Benin was one of them, and Comoros. Gosh, I can't hardly pronounce these. I mean, you need to be a livestock or meat exporters to know that some of these countries exist. I mean, to 150 countries around the world we had access to, and we accessed last year in our meat and livestock exports. So that access confers enormous advantages, as does proximity to markets. I mean, for years, Australia's location was one of the banes of our existence. I mean, our markets were all in the Northern Hemisphere, mostly in Europe, and here we were tucked down at the south of the Southern Hemisphere. I mean, that was an enormous disadvantage to us over the course of most of the 200 years of our history. But now our proximity to Asian markets, and to a lesser extent Middle East markets in the Gulf, is one of our advantages. And it's certainly, you know, I mean, the fact that, what is it, a 7 or 8 day voyage from Darwin to Jakarta, I mean, that confers enormous advantages in shipping costs from countries like Brazil and the rest of the South America. Just a couple of other factors very briefly. Our livestock performance, the fact that our livestock are fit and healthy, the fact that we have a wide range of breeds, the adaptability of our livestock, and also the provision of services, both coordinated provision of services by our industry as a whole, and the provision of services, the customer orientation of many of our exporters. And, you know, I mean, SCAS has obviously imposed significant costs on the industry, but one of the advantages is that it's forced exporters to have permanently based staff in our major markets and visit on a regular basis the minor markets. And of course that, you know, cements customer relationships, that allows provision of technical advice and know-how, and really does provide some advantages in terms of provision of services. So, where have we come from? Where we've recognised that we're a very efficient industry, that's quite obvious. We've recognised some of the reasons behind that competitiveness. Now I want to talk a little bit about the threats. Now, I mean, if this is going to be a rounded presentation, I'll probably talk about the opportunities as well. But, you know, as an economist, I work on the dark side a bit, so I focus more on the threats than the opportunities. And what I want to do for a start is just paint a bit of a picture of how I see the world going forward. The world for food generally and for livestock. Because I'm a bit worried about a couple of things. I mean, one of the things that I'm worried about is the enormous hype that now exists over agriculture generally, and Australian agriculture in particular. I mean, hype that you can see on this slide here in terms of interest, in terms of belief that Australian agriculture represents a path to riches. You know, I mean, talk to many producers in this room and you might get an impression of whether agriculture represents a path to riches. But, you know, I mean, this hype, in a way, is exemplified in this dreadful statement that the dining boom was about to replace the mining boom for Australia. I mean, that statement was first uttered, I think, by a Coles executive, but it's been repeated ad nauseum by people who ought to know better, like politicians and some industry leaders and analysts. I mean, there seems to be a belief that all we have to do is produce more food and the world will buy it, and the world will buy it at higher prices. And that belief's all based around this statement that's received a lot of publicity. Some analysis done by the FAO in 2007 that said that the world would need 70% more food by 2050. 70% more food by 2050. Well, you know, the dining boom rather than mining boom, I mean, you might think that it makes sense. But here are the sober facts. Here are the sober facts. That world demand for food is slowing. The growth in world demand for food is slowing. And that's just not something that Peter Barnard's saying. It's something that's verified by the facts that are listed in these tables here. And just concentrate on the one on the left-hand side as you look at it, which is the rate of increase in food demand per annum. And between 1960 and 71, in 1961 and 70, I mean, food demand grew at 2.7% annually. Between 1991 and 2000, 1.7% per annum. In the current decade, 1.2% per annum. So from 2.7% between 1961 and 70, 2.7% in that decade, to 1.2% currently. And it's predicted to drop even further. Well, why is this drop? Well, let me tell you, world demand for food is basically just driven by two factors. By two factors alone. The rate of growth, the rate of increase in the world's population, and the rate of increase in the world's GDP or income. And you can see some more facts. The rate of increase in the world's population is falling. I mean, in the 25 years, 1950 to 75, the world's population increased by 62%. In the current 25 years, it increased by 41%. And you can see major countries like China. I mean, isn't this chart interesting? The chart on the right-hand side. This fall in the Chinese population. And of course, they've now come round to the view that this one-child policy that they've had perhaps needs some revision. But this is not going to change these figures, let me tell you. It might have an impact beyond 2050, but it won't change this chart very much because these policy shifts take a long time to come through in terms of population changes. It's been, as I was told by a professor in Japan just a few months ago, he said it's been a policy that's been too successful. So the world's population growth is slowing and the world's GDP growth is also slowing. I mean, I'm not going to go into the factors behind this. There are real factors that underlie these projections of slowing world GDP growth. Let me just say to you, I mean, we've had a remarkable decade. I mean, 2000 to 2010 was a remarkable decade in terms of income growth across the world. I mean, led by China, with these growth rates approaching 10%. 10% per annum growth rates. I mean, that's just remarkable. And it's never likely to be repeated again. I mean, there were particular factors contributing to that, factors that are unlikely to arise in the future. And you look into the future, I mean, the major country with a big population that's likely to experience significant GDP growth is India. But there's a problem there, of course. They don't eat much meat. So world demand for food is slowing. The growth in world demand for food is slowing based on what's happening with population and based on what's happening with GDP. I mean, the 70% figure's correct, that the world needs 70% more food between 2007, when that figure was done, and 2050. But it's easily achievable. We've achieved it in the past, more than in the past. We've had rates of growth of food demand well in excess of 70%. And we're likely to achieve it going out to 2050. I mean, without allocating an extra hectare of the world's land to agricultural production, all that's required to meet that 70% target is about a 1% growth in productivity per year. And the chart on the right-hand side shows that historically we've been well in excess of 1%. And that's, of course, why real prices for agricultural products have declined over time. The productivity growth has been well in excess of demand growth. Now, you might say to me, oh, Peter, but, you know, surely this productivity growth is slowing. I mean, what you've got up there is average growth between 61 and 2011. Surely now it's slowing. Let me tell you, on the latest data, no evidence that productivity growth is slowing. It's slowing to a degree in the developed world, particularly in Australia, and I'll come to that in a moment, but it isn't slowing in the developing world, and that's the key issue. So look, you know, I don't want to pour too much cold water on this hype, and I might have done that in a way. But, you know, I think at the very least, some caution is warranted. And against that backdrop of slowing growth in demand for food, a fiercely competitive world agricultural marketplace, which it's always been. I mean, there was some respite from that between 2000 and 2010, but agriculture worldwide has always been fiercely competitive. Against that backdrop, this is what worries me. Because what worries me, a sense, is that the hype will distract us from the challenges that we really face. And I talked at the beginning of this address about the fact that currently, our livestock production, our food production generally in Australia, is highly competitive, currently. But it's this chart. It's the information in this chart, if continued, that will affect whether we're competitive in the future. And what you can see in this chart is that rates of growth of agricultural productivity in Australia now lag the rest of the world, or a number of significant countries in the rest of the world. That was the case for agricultural production generally. A similar story for the cattle industry. You know, rates of productivity growth that are falling, that between 1988 and 2000 averaged 1.9% for the Australian beef industry. Over the last 12 years to 2012, they're down to 0.7%. So there's many reasons for this, but of course, I think, you know, we need to think about what we need to do to address it. And this, I just think this is a critical area. The continual emphasis, the continual focus on research and development. I mean, we've always been a world leader in this area. But let me tell you, I mean, capability is slipping. I mean, state and federal governments are getting out of this area almost as quick as their feet can carry them. And perhaps the lack of attention in this area, perhaps the lower resources, are now starting to be reflected in those productivity figures. Of course, we not only need to worry about on-farm productivity, but there's also all those off-farm costs. I mean, the fact that we are amongst the highest wage cost countries in the world, the fact that that's definitely affecting our processing sector, as some of these articles attest to, and many of you might have seen this chart before, but it sort of indicates the cost impediment that exists down the supply chain in Australia, that our processing costs are 2.4% higher than the United States, 3% higher than in Brazil, and even higher than our cousins across the Tasman. And you might say, I mean, people they might be sitting back in their chairs and saying, well, that's good for us as an industry. That's good for the live export industries. Those processors aren't as competitive. That will allow us greater access to livestock. And I mean, to an extent that's true, but we all suffer from these supply chain costs. I mean, certainly we all suffer from our appalling road network. I mean, ABARES have just put out a report released in the last couple of weeks about the costs on rural Australia, the costs on our industry in particular, of the poor road network. Engineers Australia have come out and publicly stated that Australia's road network is in poor condition, particularly in rural areas. And then there's other areas of the transport chain. I mean, I attended a workshop of livestock producers, of livestock exporters in Perth earlier this year, and they told me that port congestion in Perth was adding $10 per head for cattle shipped out of that port, $1 per head for sheep. And I needn't talk much about SCAS because you all know it, but costs of up to $45 in terms of regulatory burden imposed by SCAS. Look, just a couple of other matters very quickly. And I note that Dick Slaney asked a question to the previous speaker about the probability of an FMD outbreak in Australia, in Indonesia. I'm much more interested in the probability of an outbreak in this country. And to be honest with you, I've just done a lot of work on the meat industry strategic plan, and it shocked me. I've been, as Don said, I've worked in this industry for many years. It shocked me the level of probability of an FMD outbreak, according to the best studies done, an FMD outbreak in Australia of 0.5% per annum, a probability of 0.5% per annum, to 2%. It's probably at that lower end. And you know, you might say, well, those are low probabilities, but you know, in a way, it's a bit like going into an operating theatre, you know, being put under the knife, and as you're being wheeled in on the trolley, the surgeon leans over and says, oh, look, you know, the chances of this, anything going wrong in this operation are quite low, about 1 in 1,000. And you're sitting on the trolley thinking, boy, that seems too high to me. And you know, 1 in 200 years, which is the 0.5% probability, seems too high to me, given, you know, it seems an incredible potential disaster that this industry faces. And I think it places emphasis on both prevention and preparation. I mean, community support clearly, look, I'm not going to say much about this because you've probably heard it from 1,000 people over the last couple of days, but clearly a competitive threat to this industry. Clearly a competitive threat to this industry. And, you know, I'd only plead as somebody with a real interest in this industry to use this period of respite, because that's what you got, a period of respite, to really shore up the systems and make sure that they're as waterproof as possible. And then a couple of other things that again came up in the previous speech, and I'll deal with them very quickly, but again they form a bit of the backdrop of the environment that the total industry faces, including the live export industry. And I mean, it's this concern, these continual doubts that are being thrown up about the health properties of meat consumption, and you know, there's this general ebbing in demand. There is a definite ebbing in demand due to these causes, and occasionally that ebbing gets a real jolt with reports like the World Health Organization report. And then there's these environmental issues that, again, you know, in a sense, meat's become a pariah. I mean, in terms of causing environmental damage. I mean, the meat industry is seen by some as a major polluter, a major cause of the world's greenhouse gas problems. MLA does some studies that in Australia, 2% of people are eating less meat because of these environmental concerns, that they're turning off the product due to these environmental concerns, and that's likely to grow going forward. I mean, we've got to twist this debate round, because let me tell you, I mean, what the charts on the right-hand side show is the recommended Australian diet. The top chart shows the recommended Australian diet versus what we're currently eating. And the recommended diet is basically the same amount of protein, but cut down the junk foods. Cut down, you know, the soft drinks, cut down the potato chips, dare I say it in the Northern Territory, cut down the alcohol. I mean, cut down the junk foods. And you see that what the bottom chart says is if the junk foods are cut out, they're major polluters, that will contribute very significantly to reducing greenhouse gases from food production. So, you know, Paul McCartney has it wrong when he talks of meatless Mondays. I mean, what he ought to be talking about is beerless Mondays or potato chip-free Mondays or whatever. Cut out the junk foods, and that's a major cause of greenhouse gas problems. So, look, we've obviously covered a lot of ground. Self-evidently, a world competitive industry. Competitiveness is particularly based on the competitiveness of our livestock production systems in Australia, but also great market access, proximity to markets. But, you know, I think there are real competitive challenges coming up, and don't necessarily believe the hype. Thank you.
thank you, Peter. You never cease to entertain and inform, so thank you very much. Questions, please, if anybody has them. Stunned them, Peter. You've absolutely stunned them. Oh, sorry, over this side, yeah.
Thanks, Peter. I'm very agreed with what you said just now about the population growth, particularly in China. You are right, and given even they changed the policy, which is about 2 months ago, they wouldn't change any what's going to happen in the next 20, 30 years. So in that turn, the population growth in China will going down rather than going up. So from that point of view, the demand from China will be affected by that, I would say. So my question for you is, what do you suggest for Australian industry, in this industry, to compete with others in terms of the demand itself is not going up as what we think? Yeah.
Well, I think in terms of the approach by the Australian industry, as I indicated, I think we've got to maintain our competitive position in terms of costs. The terms of trade of agriculture, including the livestock industries, generally go down by 2% a year. That's what happens over a long period of time. Your terms of trade go down by 2% a year, and I don't see that changing enormously in the future. And that means to stay ahead in Australia, you've got to get productivity gains of around that sort of area, just to keep your head above water. But I think there's some other things that we can do too. In China, and across the developing world generally, there's this interest in food safety, in the integrity of the product, in ensuring that that the food that you're providing your family is wholesome and safe. And I think that has already helped us significantly in China. Obviously, it's a bigger issue in China than across many countries because of some of the history of events in China, his interest in food safety. But, Australia is seen as having world-leading integrity systems, clean, green food, and again, it's just important that we continue to get that message across. We continue to maintain our integrity systems in Australia, and we think that there's a job to do there too, to make sure that they continue to evolve and be world-class. But I think, we've got to work on the supply side in terms of remaining competitive, but also on the demand side in ensuring that our product continues to be appreciated in places like China.
Further questions? Peter, I just have one to ask you in relation, and it sort of relates slightly to the question from the gentleman previous. If you have, say, a declining population in the likes of China, just using that as an example, but at the same time you have a rising or expanding middle class, which with higher disposable incomes, doesn't that make up some of the factors that we were talking about before, as far as the need to increase production to supply that zone in the socio-economic balance?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. It does make up some of that shortfall. But the critical thing is, people need to focus on not absolutes, but rates of change. And what I pointed out in those GDP figures is that we're unlikely to continue to get those 10% GDP growth rates that China was just achieving over the last decade. That's unlikely to be achieved in the future. So in terms of rates of change, that middle class will still grow, but it will grow at a lesser rate than it has in the past.
Well, I've got one question here from the lady in green. I'll just get the mic for you if you could.
If the middle classes are growing in these developing countries, won't the wages and cost of productivity for agriculture in those countries grow as well? And will that be advantageous to Australia?
Yeah. Look, I think that's true. And one of the things that people miss is that, you know, I talked about world agricultural production generally increasing at rates over the last 40 or 50 years to more than meet the increase in demand. And that increase in production has come from many countries. I mean, it's certainly come from Australia. And, you know, we look at our production and on a declining herd, we're producing more beef than ever before. But it's also comes from countries like China. I mean, agricultural production in China has increased significantly and probably will slow in the future. I just forget now the rates of productivity change that China has traditionally achieved, but I suspect that it's probably around 2% per annum. And what I say is that even if you ratchet that back a little bit, you know, you still have enough capacity to more than meet the predicted increase in world demand. And, you know, I've been fortunate enough to travel down to South America over the years, over many years. And I wasn't fortunate enough to hear Ian Mars's talk yesterday. But, you know, I mean, I just look at that country and I still see incredible potential for improvements in productivity across South American agriculture generally. So, you know, I mean, this Malthusian view that's been around for, I don't know, 300 or 400 years, that, you know, we'll run out of steam in terms of productivity improvements in agriculture. I mean, there's absolutely no evidence for it. Absolutely no evidence for it.
Look, thank you, Peter. I'm going to have to draw it to a close. We do need to head to morning tea. Would you once again thank Peter Barnard? I can only say in conclusion, Peter, as an economist, as you mentioned yourself, a self-admission, you dance on the dark side now and then, and it sort of, it inspires a little fear in us, but at the same time, it never ever prevents you as an audience. It provokes thought, and it's a fantastic presentation. So thank you, Peter. It's great.